Hey, everybody. It is Wednesday, May 29th. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast. Good morning. I'm mo.news.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, happy National Flip-Flop Day. Yes, flip-flops have their own day.
Of course they do. Everything has its own day. Not supportive of those flip-flops, I have to say.
You're not a flip-flop person.
I used to be, but now that I've entered the fourth decade of my life, I need a little more support.
I get it. They are good summer shoes. Speaking of which, in other headlines today, we saw some new numbers come out when it comes to where Americans rank when it comes to deodorant use globally.
I'm going to guess pretty high as somebody who's traveled to other parts of this great big world.
What are you implying, Jill? You're right. In fact, we're number one. We're number one in deodorant usage. Americans last year, according to the latest stats, bought $6.6 billion worth of deodorant. That averages out when you average it out to all Americans at $20 per person. Obviously, not all Americans wear deodorant, so some spend more, some spend less. But it turns out the deodorant market is exploding. You might have seen more full-body deodorants hitting the market right now. That's not just for under your arms anymore. They're seeing that Americans want to get rid of the smell everywhere. Here
is my question for our listeners. I have struggled finding a natural deodorant. That is my goal. I want a more natural deodorant.
Without the aluminum and some of that stuff, right?
But yeah. I cannot find one that works for more than an hour. And it's now summer, so it's not even an option.
So we're looking for natural, but we're looking for effective.
But it's got to work.
Combine those two, yes.
Correct. So if anybody has one, hit me up. My Instagram, Jill R. Wagner. I will take all suggestions. I might even post this question tomorrow as well.
You should.
I might even post this question a little bit later today as well.
All right, we will crowdsource you a solution there, Jill, before the summer gets any hotter.
All right, let's get to some headlines here. Wild weather across the country. Over 1 million customers are without power in Texas alone, and officials say it could last days. To the West Coast, why some progressive district attorneys are losing their grip on some of the most liberal cities in the country. To the Middle East, that $320 million U.S. Gaza aid pier is now shut down after damage from heavy weather, when it might be up and running again, and what the IDF says was behind the deadly Rafah fire. Closing arguments at the Donald Trump hush money trial, and was that Robert De Niro outside of court? What?
We'll tell you about De Niro's press conference outside the Trump trial and his altercation with some hecklers.
The U.S. box office is on track to have the worst Memorial Day weekend since 1995. Speaking of the movies, the famous Home Alone house on sale for $5.25 million.
We'll tell you about some recent renovations they made to the house and the parts that you still will recognize from the movie back in the early 90s.
All right, here is a tune from Home Alone. If you know it, you know it, but YouTube Music is soon going to let you search by humming into your phone. So kind of like Shazam, but just with humming.
Jill, I don't know if I got that hum from the Home Alone. I hope that YouTube Music will figure it out.
It was rocking around the Christmas tree.
Oh, I thought we were going with one of the John Williams songs. You went with one of the traditional Christmas songs. Got it.
And Moshe, of course, will have On This Day in History.
Speaking of Christmas tunes, Joe, White Christmas celebrates a birthday today. We'll give you the interesting backstory behind it, including the Jewish composer Irving Berlin and what inspired White Christmas.
Okay, let's start with some of the deadly severe weather that has hit the United States in recent days. More than 1 million customers in Texas are without power as powerful storms delivered another round of violent weather to the state, still reeling from an almost unrelenting parade of destructive and deadly storms in recent weeks. We are talking hurricane-force wind gusts across the Dallas area, The Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport recorded a wind gust of 77 miles per hour early Tuesday as power outages in the area began to skyrocket. That same damaging storm system that tore through Dallas then hit Houston with hurricane-force winds Tuesday afternoon. The power outages really started to ramp up early Tuesday morning in the Dallas area and then extended south with the storms as they just roared across the state. Hundreds of thousands of outages were in Dallas County, where officials issued a disaster declaration, and they warned that these outages could last for days. And it all comes as some residents are still mourning at least 7 people killed in the state during violent storms over Memorial Day weekend in what was the deadliest tornado outbreak in the state in nearly a decade.
Jill, I've been in touch with my parents who are in the Fort Worth area. They lost power 2 days ago. Yesterday, they didn't lose power. They were lucky, but the internet went down, and they've been waiting for that to come back. Also, I've been hearing from a number of members of the mo.news community in both the Dallas area as well as the Houston area, where there are several 100,000 people there without power. Right now, the forecast models show that there will be wet weather and some severe weather potentially through the rest of the week in Texas. It could expand to the Rockies and the High Plains as well. As far as the weekend, right now, 25 people were killed in storms, including 4 children across 5 different states. That includes Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and Kentucky. Also saw some severe weather in North Carolina and Virginia as well. In Cook County, Texas, 7 people were killed in a mobile home park. 2 people were killed in Oklahoma at an outdoor wedding. And there were at least 5 people killed in Kentucky, according to the governor there. So as we've noted, we're in this severe weather season right now, tornado season. So be sure to have a weather app or 2 with alerts, because some of these storms come in very quickly and sometimes even surprise meteorologists.
Okay, now on to politics. Progressive prosecutors are struggling to keep their positions along the West Coast. Voters in historically Democratic stronghold cities are expressing concern about rising crime rates at the ballot box, and therefore voting against candidates that have had more lenient approaches to crime. So last week, Progressive District Attorney Mike Schmidt was defeated by his tough-on-crime challenger from his own office, Nathan Vasquez. He is an independent who was previously registered as a Republican. Vasquez places blame on Schmidt for Portland's growing problems with drugs and crime in recent years. And Moshe, this certainly is not the only example. Voters ousted San Francisco's district attorney Chesa Boudin, a public defender turned prosecutor, from the office in 2022 over his anti-tough-on-crime policies. Another recall could happen in Alameda County, which includes Oakland, and that's where DA Pamela Price faces an ouster vote in November over surging crime rates in the area. And then in Los Angeles, George Gascon, one of the country's most progressive prosecutors, is also fighting a close re-election race.
Yeah, and Gascon has actually faced a couple attempts at recall, and they haven't worked out yet. And there's some questions about what was going on there. But this November could spell his end in L.A. And across the board here, Jill, we've been hearing this from a number of people in the mo.news community, including liberals, self-described liberals, who are like, I thought that these policies might work. I'm not a fan of these policies anymore. There are parts of town that I no longer feel safe bringing my kids to. And so I think it's time for a reset of sorts. You are hearing from folks on the left, from the progressives, that they haven't given these policies enough time, and there are other reasons for the surge in crime here. But still, it appears voters, particularly here, even liberal voters, have lost patience here with a number of these DAs. As we take a closer look at the ground, we can look at a number of crimes that have been increasing over the last few years. When it comes to homicides in San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, all places where they have recalled their DAs. They consistently have seen an increase here in the past few years. San Francisco had the highest number of murders between 2009 and 2019. And then you start to see a surge in Portland and Seattle, a significant surge in Portland in particular. Now, while these cities across the board have seen surges by their standards, they certainly are not high when it comes to murder rate nationally or per capita when it comes to other cities. But where they do rank very high per capita is car theft. All 3 areas, the Bay Area, San Francisco, and Oakland, Portland, and Seattle, top 10 when it comes to auto theft in this country in terms of overall likelihood to get your car broken into or stolen. Jill, I remember recently leaving I remember recently posting a photo of a parked car, my parked car, in New York, and some people from the Bay Area are like, "Oh my God, there's stuff in your car. You should clear out your car before you leave it alone." I'm like, "Is that how you guys are living in the Bay Area now?" They're like, "Yeah, like it's been like that for years. Like you have to ensure that your car is completely empty because you could wake up the next morning and in all likelihood it might be gone." So, we have seen auto theft, property crime issues in those cities. We've also seen homelessness and opioid overdose deaths also increase, in particular in Portland, where people say that there's just certain parts of town where people are high and walking into the street. And of course, the policies that progressives in particular have been pushing here is one that is focused on treatment and not necessarily putting anyone behind bars or any sort of law enforcement role here. And so I think what you're seeing is sort of a concern that there might have been an overcorrection, and you're seeing this pushback now in Portland in particular. That's the most recent example of this. And so we'll see what happens when it comes to stats nationally. Overall, we should note there was a surge in crime during COVID. Crime is down, but the perception of crime remains up. It's sort of the thing we continue to see with the economy as well. The people's perception of where things are at and where things are actually at are different, but still we are seeing numbers in a number of cities that are higher than pre-COVID. So you saw the surge in COVID. They're gradually coming down. They're not at pre-COVID levels in a number of places. And so we're seeing that now impact how people are voting.
All right, time for the speed read from the Washington Post. The Pentagon saying Tuesday that it has suspended the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza via its floating pier after mishaps in which 4 U.S. military vessels were beached. 1 U.S. service member was critically injured, and sections of the structure were ripped free in bad weather. The damage will require that the U.S. military, with the assistance from Israel, will disassemble pieces of the pier attached to the Gazan shore, rebuild them in the nearby Israeli port of Ashdod, and then transport them back to the Gazan shore and reconnect them. That process is expected to take about a week, temporarily eliminating the pier as an option to deliver humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza as Israel continues its months-long military campaign against Hamas.
Jill, I feel like this is sort of a metaphor for U.S. policy in the Middle East sometimes. This pier that they spend a whole bunch of money on hasn't been very effective. I mean, it's sad, but you have to laugh. You're like, they spent all this time and money on this, and it's been pretty ineffective before it went underwater and they have to rebuild the thing. They've had trouble getting aid there to the intended people. A number of trucks, they noted in the first weekend that none of the aid that they had shipped out, the tons and tons of aid, actually got to the intended place, with various armed groups, potentially Hamas, etc., stealing from the trucks. At the same time, you have a statement from the Pentagon, which says, the pier proved highly valuable in delivering aid to the people of Gaza. Thus, upon completion of the pier repair and reassembly, the intention is to re-anchor the temporary pier and resume humanitarian aid to the people who need it most. Remember, Biden announced this project back when he gave the State of the Union. It took a while. One of the issues was the lack of land routes. Now there are a bunch of land routes. Now they have the sea route. Now it's underwater. So they're looking to get this. They're looking to get this back and running here, Jill, as they try to ensure that enough humanitarian aid is getting in to Gaza.
Okay, now to a follow-up to the story that we reported yesterday about the Israeli strike that ended up killing dozens of civilians in the Gaza city of Rafah. This from the Associated Press. The Israeli Defense Forces saying Tuesday that hidden Hamas weapons that they were unaware of may have been the actual cause of a deadly fire in Rafah, and that an Israeli airstrike that targeted a nearby area had used small munitions that would not have been able to ignite such a big fire on its own. The military says that it was unaware of the munitions or that other combustible substance that caused a secondary explosion, and that a fire spread in a complex that was housing displaced Gazans, killing dozens of civilians. So, Moshe, this is a long way of saying that Israel seems to think here that they did this very targeted attack on Hamas leaders, and somehow perhaps a piece of shrapnel or something else wound up blowing up munitions on the ground that they were unaware of, which caused the fire. Needless to say, Palestinians searched through charred remains. They described a horrifying scene of people running to escape the fire. Palestinians who survived Sunday's strike, which local officials say killed at least 45 people in that area where displaced civilians were sheltering in tents. They described it as a desperate bid to escape the fire, while others sought to identify their loved ones among the remains.
So, Jill, that's a preliminary report from the Israeli forces. They're going to continue to investigate what took place here. And, we are hearing the witness accounts, the horrific scene on the ground that regardless of what the cause of the explosion was, led to the deaths of a number of innocent people there in that tent encampment. So the IDF here was trying to track two Hamas commanders to this compound they were in Gaza, nearby this tent encampment, just a few meters away from this tent encampment. Apparently, it had been used for Hamas activity, including launching rockets on Israel earlier in the day. That then led to the strike. That then led to that secondary explosion in the tent encampment. So still a lot of details coming in here as they try to figure out what took place. Regardless, condemnations around the world, the UN holding a special meeting to discuss this, as the UN does. But a condemnation even from governments that have been friendly to Israel through all of this, have been allied with them, the French, the Germans. As far as the Americans, yesterday, John Kirby, the White House spokesperson, was asked whether there's going to be any policy change towards Israel related to what took place on the ground Sunday into Monday there. He said basically nothing will change. Right now, the test for the administration, the issue for the administration would be a full-scale ground operation in Rafah, that the U.S. does not believe that's warranted. And right now, they do not believe the Israelis are engaged in that. So they don't see a need to change any policies. The American officials, including Vice President Harris and others yesterday, calling the aftermath there in Rafah, the explosion, the deaths of the civilians, heartbreaking, tragic, horrific. We should note right now the Israelis are continuing to pursue Hamas inside Rafah. That's where, as of a month ago, you had about 1.5 million Palestinians, mainly displaced Palestinians, over the course of the past 4 weeks. It now appears more than 1 million Palestinians have left Rafah, have evacuated Rafah, so about 3/4 of the population that was there about a month ago. There were concerns going into this whether they were going to be able to effectively evacuate people, whether there was room for them in other places. Many of them have gone to a camp called Al-Mawasi. And it comes as Israel really stands alone here as it presses forward with its controversial offensive in Rafah, despite the opposition they're getting from around the world. The Israelis saying they're doing as much as they can to keep civilians out of danger. At the end of the day, though, we're talking again, the whole Gaza Strip is 27 miles by 6 miles. You have 2.5 million people there, the majority of whom are displaced, as you've seen tens of thousands of buildings, apartment buildings, residences destroyed through this war. And so that continues to be an ongoing concern as this war now continues into pretty soon an 8th month.
Switching gears now from Axios, an update on the Donald Trump hush money trial. Former President Trump's defense team hammered Michael Cohen in closing arguments yesterday, calling Trump's former fixer a, quote, MVP of liars. In his final presentation before jury deliberations, Trump lawyer Todd Blanche made one last attempt to destroy the star witness's credibility, calling him, quote, the human embodiment of reasonable doubt. He argued you cannot convict President Trump on any crime beyond a reasonable doubt, on the words of Michael Cohen. He lied to Congress, he lied to prosecutors, he lied to his family and business associates.
The other side goes last, as prosecutors do, because they have to prove their case. The onus is on them to prove their case to the jury. In their closing arguments, the prosecutors said, we didn't pick up Cohen at the witness store. The defendant chose Michael Cohen to be his fixer. He picked him for the same qualities that the defense now urges you to reject his testimony over. Essentially, Trump liked that he was a good liar on his behalf until he ultimately had to flip there. Remember, the prosecution here has to prove a challenging case. There's 34 felony counts, so the jury will have to go through all 34 of those counts. They come down to Trump essentially lying about his reimbursement to Cohen to try to change the election result in 2016. The prosecution arguing in the case before the jury yesterday that there's a chance that Trump might have not have become president in 2016 if this Stormy Daniels story had come out. That's part of their case here. Either way, we conclude here the first criminal trial in history for a former president. And the question will be, these 12 jurors, will they be able to come to unanimous agreement on any of the 34 charges? Will they find him guilty on any? Will they find him not guilty on any? Or will we have a hung jury? And that's the thing we'll be watching over the next few days. And I don't know how long this will take, Jill, maybe weeks.
And then there was the action outside of the courthouse. The Biden campaign staged a news conference after months of deliberately avoiding commenting on Trump's criminal cases. And it was an unusual event featuring two former police officers who protected the Capitol on January 6th and actor Robert De Niro. What? Okay, here is some of what De Niro had to say.
Donald Trump wants to destroy not only the city, but the country, and eventually he could destroy the world. We New Yorkers used to tolerate him when he was just another grubby real estate hustler masquerading as a big shot, a two-bit playboy lying his way into the tabloids. But this city is pretty accommodating. We make room for clowns. We have them all over the city. People who do crazy things in the street, we tolerate it. It's part of the city, it's part of the culture. But not a person like Trump who will eventually run the country. That does not work, and we all know that.
Jill, since this election is all about septuagenarians and octogenarians, De Niro is 80. So I just feel like we have an election between an 81-year-old and a 78-year-old. So everyone in their age bracket has to come out and speak.
Okay, so I guess we're waiting for Morgan Freeman, James Earl Jones, who we mentioned yesterday on the podcast, Martha Stewart. She's 80, I believe. So does that make her too old?
No, it's just right. De Niro's 80.
It's perfect.
Jack Nicholson, he's 87. Clint Eastwood's 93. Let's bring them all out, man. Let's bring out. But, obviously, there's a lot of people in Hollywood, celebs, who like to make their political opinions known. De Niro's been very outspoken, has said some very blunt words for Trump. When you asked the Biden campaign about this, they said, listen, he's not here to talk about the trial. We just see all the cameras lined up outside the trial, so we thought we would take advantage of it. And so De Niro tried to take advantage of it. It turns out that, as he talked about, New York being a place for clowns, etc., he clashed with some hecklers. There were some New Yorkers who were out there who were pro-Trump, who then were heckling De Niro, interrupting him, calling him a bad actor, washed up. Then De Niro gives it back to them. We have a clip of this over on the Instagram feed anyway. So there was that circus outside of the courthouse yesterday. By the way, the Trump campaign did have their own press conference afterwards and responded to De Niro's allegations, joking that their press conference was going to take less time than The Irishman, that they wouldn't make people sit through a 3-hour press conference. Jill, you ever see Irishman?
I've never seen The Irishman. Have you?
I have, Jill. It was more than 3 hours long, and it definitely needed some editing. But it was straight to streaming, so they let Scorsese basically leave everything in the movie.
Well, speaking of movies from CNN, the summer movie season typically starts with a bang during the month of May, and particularly during Memorial Day weekend. This year, though, it is a whimper. Memorial Day weekend, Friday through Monday, movie ticket sales are estimated at 128.3 million. That is according to ComScore data provided to CNN. And that is down from last year's Memorial Day weekend, which recorded just shy of 205 million in gross revenue. And it lands well under the record holiday in 2013 when Fast and Furious 6 drove the weekend to 314.3 million in revenue. So I know that's a lot of numbers, but the bottom line here is that the U.S. box office is on track to have its lowest grossing Memorial Day weekend since 1995, when Casper haunted the screens, and that is not even adjusting for inflation. Last summer, though, you got blockbusters like Barbie and Oppenheimer. They combined added about $1 billion to the domestic box office. But this year, studios are betting on a large slate of mid-range sequels and prequels, as well as family-focused animated films to fill the Barbenheimer-shaped hole. This includes Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, Bad Boys, Ride or Die, and Inside Out 2. The tepid Memorial Day weekend continues what has been a lukewarm start to the summer box office. Coupled with production delays, there's also the aftershocks of the multi-month-long Writers Guild and SAG-AFTRA strikes that are still reverberating across studios. But Moshe, I think what hit the nail on the head here is what I just mentioned. Studios are betting on a large slate of mid-range sequels and prequels. Like, we don't want them anymore. We're done. I mean, we're tapped
Jill,
out.
Later this summer, there's Despicable Me 4 coming out. Are you pumped?
No, I'm done with the sequels and the prequels. I'm somewhat excited for the Moana sequel. I think my
Moana
daughter
2
will
is
enjoy
coming.
it.
Yeah.
But that's two. Okay.
Well, and I'll say later this year you'll also have the Joker movie that's coming out with Lady Gaga. Which should be good. That'll be in the fall, but that's probably the only movie that I'm like looking towards that I might consider going to the theater for anytime soon. There's also the Wicked movie that's coming out later this year as well that they just put out the trailer for. That said, summer accounts for 40% of overall movie theater revenue, and as the summer goes the year, so it's not looking very good for them right now. And as you mentioned, Jill, there is the aftermath of the strike last year, and we knew the strike would have an impact because things were shut down for a number of months there. And so we're feeling it now in sort of the mid part of 2024. Hopefully things ramp up again in 2025, but the movie business has changed, right? Comedies go straight to streaming. So really the only films they think can do well are the international films, which happen to be action movies. And so, we'll see what happens. I mentioned Joker is coming out in October. You got Transformers 1, Beetlejuice coming out in September. Those are the names that they list here that the studios have hopes for. Hard times, Jill, if you're looking for a new idea, a new film that doesn't have the number 2 through, 14 behind it.
Or a prequel. That's like, what happened to them in high school?
Exactly, which I think we're going to be getting soon. Actually, didn't we just do the story recently about Reese Witherspoon announcing with Amazon the prequel to
Legally Blonde?
Legally Blonde. Because, we wanted to know what happened to her before she went to college.
Yes, because Elle Woods in elementary school really seems compelling.
Listen, I will tell you this. It was a huge idea over at CBS when I was at CBS when they announced the, Big Bang Theory was the biggest show in the world. And so Young Sheldon did very well for CBS. That just ended. So, I think when done strategically, there is an opportunity for prequels. Obviously, the Star Wars films introduced that concept decades ago. But to your point, it's either like, oh, you know what's new? You know what's not a sequel? A prequel. And not like, hey, does anyone have any new ideas out there? My hope, though, is that social media will help cultivate creativity. That was one of the hopes here, that it democratizes your entry into films and TV, and some really creative people, on social media platforms like TikTok, Instagram, etc., could, push some interesting concepts. I guess selling it to the studio and having them invest in it is another story.
Right. And Better Call Saul, that was a prequel to Breaking Bad. That did really well. So I'm not trying to be snarky about it. I guess I like original thought. I like original characters.
I hear you.
And these prequels and sequels are not doing it for me. Okay, sticking with the theme of movies here, from the Chicago Tribune, one of the most famous movie residences is for sale. But anyway, yes, you probably could have guessed it. The Home Alone house in the Chicago suburbs is on the market for $5.25 million. This is according to Zillow. The listing says this is a chance to own a piece of cinematic history. The listing went live on Friday. The house was last sold in 2012 for $1.59 million. So yeah, we are talking triple here. The red brick Georgian home, built in 1921 in the Chicago suburb of Winnetka, Illinois, among the most expensive neighborhoods in the United States. At 9,126 square feet, the house has 4 fireplaces, 5 bedrooms, and 6 bathrooms, as well as an outdoor and indoor hot tub.
All for the pretty price of $5.25 million. If there isn't a bidding war for this house, which I mentioned there could be. Jill, 9,000 square feet, that's a big house to heat, I was just thinking. Especially with those Chicago winters.
And keep cool in the summer. It works both ways.
Right. In Chicago, we get those hot summers and we get those cold winters. It's one of the joys of living there on the living there close to Lake Michigan. So parts of the house, you might have seen some of the tours on Instagram and TikTok in the past few days. They basically invited any and all realtors to do tours for everybody. Parts of the house still recognizable to the film that came out back in 1990. There have been a lot of renovations, but that main foyer, that main staircase where Kevin McAllister goes sledding down the steps, you'll recognize that. Back in 1990, part of the film was shot in the house for a number of months. And they actually did some improvement to it. They actually had to build that exterior staircase to the basement to allow the burglars to slip down. So they made some changes, but most of the interior sequences were actually filmed in a nearby high school in Chicago. There's actually a series that goes behind the films, and they go into the, among other things, in one episode, the filming of Home Alone. So a lot of elements of the house you won't recognize because they basically created the attic and other portions of the house in a nearby high school to shoot those sequences. Also, the kitchen now has a much more open floor plan, as one does in the year 2024. It has a sunroom attached to it. The basement has a basketball court and a home theater. So not quite the basement of Kevin McAllister in 1990. Again, the one that they built in the local high school.
Okay, Moshe, money aside, would you want to live in the Home Alone house? Or any house that was famous in a movie?
No, well, first of all, I don't want 9,000 square feet to heat or cool, like on principle. But I will say this. I used to live, when I first got to New York, in the West Village, which is not far away from the exterior of the Sex and the City house that they depicted Sarah Jessica Parker living in New York. And I have to say, the people literally had to put a sign up on the steps saying, "This is a place people live in. Please don't knock on the door. Please don't walk up the steps." So, I feel like there'd be an amusement to having a famous home, a famous exterior home at some point, but that I feel like would wear off after a while as you just have tourist after tourist after tourist coming by to take photos. And those are the ones who are, being nice. Those are the ones who are not being super intrusive.
Right. The Home Alone house, you could just see like legions of fans doing that. They're putting their hands over their face for anyone who's not watching on YouTube.
Yeah. There's just like, you'll have to have your curtains down and your shades down all the time because there's always going to be somebody with a camera outside your house.
And finally, from The Verge, the Android YouTube music app is rolling out a feature that is part Shazam and part your friend. When you say, "Hey, what's that song that goes right before you start humming out part of it?" This feature lets you hum, whistle, sing, or play a recording of a song to figure out what it is. If you have the new feature, you're going to see this new waveform icon next to the microphone icon. It appears when you tap the search button in the upper right corner of the app. I have an iPhone, not an Android, so it's not available to me. Moshe, I assume it's not available to you as well.
No, Jill, I have an iPhone. And what we learn as iPhone users is we get things years after the Android users get them. And yet we stay loyal to Apple. So here's The Verge's review. They say, actually, it works pretty well. It was able to identify actual recordings with what seemed like uncanny speed, according to their tests, a replacement for Shazam. It accurately picked out most songs when the writer for The Verge sang, whistled, or hummed into her phone. There were apparently a couple misses as well. Jill, I think it just requires you to have a somewhat of a sense of tune when you're humming a song, because otherwise the app will just be like, "We have no idea what you're trying to sing."
Pretty much the story of my life.
You don't even need to sing it, Jill. You just need to get the beat down for the hum. We'll have to ask a friend who has an Android phone to test this out pretty soon. All right, now time for On This Day in History. On this day in 1953, 71 years ago today, the first climbers confirmed to reach the summit of Mount Everest achieved that feat. They are Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. Since then, Jill, according to the latest numbers updated earlier this year, there have been 12,000 summits of Everest by just over 6,600 people. Meaning, of course, some people went twice. All right. On this day in international elections history, Benjamin Netanyahu was elected prime minister for the first time in 1996 on this day. He first served a 3-year term, then went to the opposition, then was elected again in 2009 for what would end up being 12 years in power. Then he lost again. And then he came back again in 2022. So he is, over these 3 different terms, the longest running prime minister in the country's history. And now, according to polls, the most disliked. All right, a bit of music and movie history as we end here. On this day in 1942, American singer and actor Bing Crosby recorded the holiday classic, I've Been Dreaming of a White Christmas. It became one of the best-selling singles of all time. So the song was written by Irving Berlin. He composed many famous classics. Irving Berlin was actually Jewish. His original name was Israel. He changed it to Irving. He wrote it for his Catholic wife. They were apart one Christmas, a couple Christmases before 1942. He talks to the person who's taking notes. He said, as he laid out the lyrics to them, not only is it the best song I ever wrote, it's the best song anybody ever wrote. That's what Irving Berlin said about it. So he was so excited about this, he takes it to Hollywood for a musical he was writing, and he casts, who else? Bing Crosby into the role to then sing that classic.
I'm definitely a fan of the song. I think it's a bold claim to say it's the best thing anyone's ever written.
I feel like it's very Kanye West, right? Irving Berlin and Kanye West. Like if I said, who said the following quote? It's the best song anyone's ever written.
Moshe, I think we have a question for this week's news quiz.
Yeah, our weekly news quiz over on Premium. If you're listening to this, you'll get at least one of the answers right. All right, Jill, another classic, Eye of the Tiger by Survivor, came out on this day in 1982. And Jill, in movie news, Sister Act premiered on this day in 1992, 32 years ago today, starring Whoopi Goldberg as our favorite nun. I like Sister Act, and as we talk about sequels, I also liked Sister Act 2, came out a couple years later, particularly because I love the rendition of Joyful, Joyful by a very young Lauryn Hill at the end of Sister Act 2. Do you remember that? Joyful, joyful, oh Lord, we adore thee.
Now I do. Okay, now I do.
We need that Shazam app.
It.
One of us needs to get an Android phone very quickly.
Okay, thank you all for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And give us a review in the App Store. We would really, really appreciate it.
Don't review our singing. Review the podcast,
Yes.
to be clear. Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow.